Hello and welcome. I've got Robert Morris with me today from the channel Mo Freedom Foundation. And he's an expert on geopolitics, on everything that's happening in the world right now. And let's get straight into it. So, where does the name come from, Mo Freedom Foundation?
So it's actually more Freedom Foundation on every other platform, but YouTube has character limits. So it's become Mo Freedom, which has been amusing after the just watching people use that, as people call me Mo sometimes, which I don't quite understand, but I guess I do understand. But it's great fun. More Freedom Foundation actually comes out. It's a little embarrassing as branding at this point because it seems very strongly libertarian. And
Okay.
when I started my channel, libertarian in the American sense, which in the U.S. sense, which is, real blanket hostility to government, a lot of magical thinking about how economies run. This was an ideology that I subscribed to in my late 20s, early 30s when I started this channel. It is an ideology that I no longer subscribe to. In
Okay.
fact, I'm sort of becoming to my horror, I'm becoming sort of a New Deal Democrat in my middle age, which
Okay.
is very far from the more freedom. However, I am someone who absolutely adores autonomy, freedom. It is a concept that my thinking around it evolves. I'm not a particularly philosophically rigorous guy when it comes to concepts around freedom, this, that, and the other thing, but it's the name I'm stuck with, and I've toyed with various ways of making it make more sense. On one sense, I think personally, like more freedom does describe the value proposition of my analysis.
Mhm.
I am not linked. I've fallen away from libertarianism, but I have not fallen away from a sense of like rigorous personal autonomy in my views and my analysis. I don't think I'm any smarter then well, I'm a little arrogant, but I don't think I'm any smarter than any other foreign policy analyst. I definitely don't think I'm any better connected. I have a few people that I've, met in my years in Washington D.C. or
Right.
Turkey that I can occasionally exchange views with, but really I'm not any smarter, not any better connected, but I am much more free to say what I want to say and to actually look at the world and describe it. And really nobody else has this degree of freedom. If I want to cover a topic, I read a book or two. I do other relevant research and I say what I think. And nobody at a think tank, even in academia, academics can do much more specialized work that I find tremendously valuable. But even in
Okay.
academia, people are simply not as free to be honest as I
Mhm.
am. And I think that that's a real distinction in my coverage, and one reason why I am just so off base as far as any, conventional ideological or political orientation. It's very confusing to people. And a very small percentage of people really love that,
Yeah.
and a lot of folks find it just confusing and move on.
Well, I personally find it provides for more interesting conversations because they don't go in a very predicted manner necessarily, and I suppose like I definitely resonate with what you're saying about having the freedom as well. This is also the whole point of my project right here with this channel. It's kind of I can do things, talk about things that I like to talk about outside of what I research and write about usually. I mean, I do like neuroscience and physics and stuff, but obviously there's certain things I need to do and I don't need to do, and in my channel it's more the stuff I don't need to do but want to do, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so one thing that I found has gotten more and more interesting when talking about global politics, and talking about how power works specifically, and that's something I've gotten interested in recently as well. The notion of power, theories of power. I've started studying different theories, philosophical, some more sociological, of how power functions. And you, as a geopolitics expert, and you've also written a book, as far as I know, comparing the American Empire to the British Empire to some extent. Um, I'd like you to maybe give me a definition or some sort of image as to what constitutes an empire. When can we reasonably speak of an empire? Because if I understand it correctly, like the United States is not actually like formally conquering places anymore, right? It's not actually going somewhere and putting their flag down and adding states, to the federation, right? So what makes what makes it reasonable to speak of the US as an empire?
So empire is a very confusing term. In the book that you kindly mentioned, Avoiding the British Empire, I do futz about with definitions a bit. But I think what's important to recognize at the outset is that an empire pre-industrialization and an empire post-industrialization are completely different animals. Before the Industrial Revolution, you had an environment where what mattered for power was the land that you controlled and how well you controlled that land. That was, and it was about conquest, it was about this, that, and the other thing. I sort of talk about really all of geopolitics since industrialization, from Napoleon on, as sort of a historical hangover, and an idea that there's still value in this idea of conquest and adding territory, and just being, from Napoleon to Hitler, just people being shown over and over and over again that there simply is not. I think the only comparison that you can make for the U.S. empire, and it's actually a much better comparison than most acknowledge, and that's the reason why I wrote this book, Avoiding the British Empire, is the British Empire, because the British Empire is very much a post-industrial revolution entity, controlled the world entirely during the 19th century. And because the 19th century came directly after the 18th century, where it still looked like there was value to actual conquest, the British Empire, did paint a lot of the map red. It did have a lot of going places, planting the flag and being like, "Oh, look at us, look what we've done." Because that is, back then, and still to a disturbing extent, like that is the way that folks measured imperial power or geopolitics. But to look at the British Empire as a land-based thing is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the British Empire was. What the British Empire was and what the United States is, and no empire prior to. So any comparisons to like even the Portuguese and Spanish empires, the Ottoman Empire, or God help us, the Roman Empire, are completely off base. Because what the British were able to do and what the United States has maintained, and this is the I guess, if I'm not so good with definitions and philosophy, but if we were to boil it down, what makes true empire in the modern sense is the ability to craft a global system that nobody has any choice but to be a part of. The Portuguese and the Dutch were sort of forerunners of the British in that they were internationally present. They were on, they had trade relations and outposts in most continents. It was the British that forced everybody into the same system. In every jurisdiction, they were the most powerful entity. Everywhere in the world, they were the most powerful entity, and that is still the case with the United States today.
May I interject there and do a little devil's advocate there? Wouldn't that, in a sense, though, kind of, you could argue then in a sense that at least in a limited time frame, the post-industrial imperialism of the British Empire actually was successful. It was actually, like you mentioned, Napoleon and Hitler and those being bad ideas. But in some way, you could just say, I mean, everything has to come to an end. Of course, the British Empire ended, but in a certain time frame, it was successful in what it was doing. The imperial pursuit was, in a way, working out, no?
Oh, it's extraordinarily successful. What I was characterizing as a pointless historical hangover old idea was the idea that Napoleon and Hitler both represented, which was, if we can just take this territory, if we can just take this bunch of land, and you're watching Putin fail at it extraordinarily right now. The United States has failed at it because The United States, during the Cold War, had convinced itself that, oh, this is such an existential threat that if we lose one territory, if the wrong person wins an election here, we're it's all over. So it's necessary for us to conquer. Like Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq are all examples of the United States not learning from the historical hangover and believing that there was still value to this old blood and soil Hitlerian version of conquest, even though it was nicely gussied up. But like fundamentally, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq were old school, pre-industrial attempts to exert power. And actually, all three of them were extraordinarily damaging to the real American empire. So I would not dispute at all that the British Empire was tremendously successful, as the American empire is tremendously successful today. In fact, a lot of people talk about American decline, but really, I think the only story you can tell about the past 20 years is a story of incredible U.S. imperial consolidation, with honestly the greatest barrier to it being the idiots in Washington, D.C., who continue wanting to do mass bombing because they live to do nothing other than sell weapons.
Okay, yeah, I understand. So like, what was the intention behind a lot of these bombings? Like, the way I understand it is they identify certain bigger threats. For example, Russia, who's like, let's say, stuck in the old paradigm of gaining territory. You know, they haven't upgraded yet to building a system, or maybe they're just not capable since the end of the Soviet Union. Or identify China or something like that, and you just kind of, you're knocking down these proxies with the intent to eventually weaken the big player enough for it to be knocked down afterwards. Is that the idea behind it, would you say?
I get pretty extreme. I've gotten more and more extreme in my views. I don't believe Russia or China are real players even. I don't believe they're rivals or players. I believe that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are artifacts of U.S. empire.
Really? That's interesting. Because I did hear some of this in some of the videos that I've seen of yours, and I have to say, like, I would say I agree with most of your analyses of things. And this point, I wasn't sure whether we like disagree properly, or whether there's like a difference in like semantics, or a difference in like you just said, God forbid, comparing it, God forbid, with the Roman Empire. I actually am one of those people that studies the decline of the Roman Empire to try and learn lessons for today's age. And so one thing I do actually maintain that I don't think like the US empire is like collapsing right now. I'm with you there. Just one thing I observed about the Roman Empire, which people, I suppose historians all know about this, but I mean, like, your average general public discussion about it may not be aware of it, is that once it's reached its peak, it remained there for like at least the time it took to get there, right? Like, it remained at that level for like almost 200 years before it actually started declining.
Yeah.
So for me, I feel like perhaps it's not like we're not looking at US empire decline, but we may look at US empire plateau. Or would you even disagree with that?
I disagree with that. Just the toolbox has been expanding. Like, power absolutely corrupts and can lead to chaos. And that, I mean, for sure, like, the writings of Cicero about the corruption of his own time. I mean, and the how that led. I mean, there's value there, of course, just in terms of like interpersonal relations or what have you. But the United States, in my view, has been the most powerful country in the world since 1917. There were some fitful rebellions. The last at all serious ones were the Japanese and the Germans in World War II. And ever since 1917, but I mean, 1917 things went back and forth a bit. In the United States hadn't quite realized how powerful it was, and wasn't sure it wanted the responsibility in the 20s and 30s. By the 40s, we decided to go for it, and since then, it's just been an addition to the toolbox of U.S. hegemony. people get very caught up on the fact that, well, a lot of the British Empire, like the map was painted red. Yes, but like the British Empire did not have little U.S. empire machines in everybody's pocket that like geared people towards thought processes. There's a fascinating book I've meant to read. It's like we've actually exported our ideas of psychology and mental illness to everybody. Everybody interacts with our platforms. China has had a fitful victory in that there's TikTok out there, and that's extraordinary.
Huawei.
But like, what's that?
And Huawei, for
example. And Huawei, yes.
Yeah.
I need to get more into the minutia of Huawei. I have not done an analysis of it that I would like to, but they're still, even if Huawei and TikTok are entirely successful, they're still dealing with American paradigms. They're still dealing with American technologies. You've got TikTok and you love it, but you're on an Apple phone or an Android phone. It's like, okay. And it's absolutely, you can point to China, which is the only country other than the United States that has any sovereignty left. And I think that's really debatable how much sovereignty they have left.
Okay.
And sure, China's like trying to do things, and maybe, who knows? I was more confident, not confident, but I was more worried about China as a rival before Xi Jinping, who, to my mind, is exactly what the United States wanted. Is perfect for the United States, the ideal patsy.
Can you explain that?
Oh, certainly. China, I was lectured recently on mispronouncing this name, and I'm sure I'm going to continue. Deng Xiaoping. Mao consolidated China's independence, was a delusional monster, killing tens of millions of his own people, but he did something that nobody for 100 years before Mao could do, which was actually consolidate China as an independent entity. Then Deng came in and did truly masterful things. As part, there's his economic restructuring, but also his construction of a saner Chinese ruling class. And the whole point of the process that he put together was to ensure that China would never again be at the mercy of one-man leadership. This progression, I feel like corporatist is a word I use a lot, but that may be a misapplication.
Okay. Corporatist is sometimes identified with elements of fascism, right?
I guess, yeah. But it was essentially just this idea of, obviously there was democracy was not going to happen, but within the party itself, there were elements of meritocracy. There was I'm not sure if it was ever even codified, but you have 10 years for a main guy, and then at the 5-year mark, he selects his successor. And it was a brilliant way to organize a country and a society. And basically, because of the onslaught of U.S. aggression, which very much, everyone's like, oh, we only started being mean to China under Trump. And wow, you have to not be paying attention or be maliciously ignorant to believe that. The onslaught of aggression under Bush and Obama led China to get scared and make a really stupid decision, which was to say, like, well, Mao was obviously insane and incredibly damaging, but he kept us safe. He's the guy who finally established Chinese independence. So I guess maybe we should go for like an old time Mao kind of glory thing. And we've seen what a calamitous decision this has been for China, and I believe has kneecapped them as a potential rival for a generation. And frankly, the Chinese and everybody else are running out of time. The idea that, like, there was a rules-based international order that people could participate in as equals. The United States has been enthusiastically murdering that since 2001, and it's only going to accelerate. The tools of U.S. economic power, be it sanctions, be it industrial policy, are only accelerating. And I think China had a chance to compete impressively in some kind of order of equals. I think Donald Trump was the biggest Chinese opportunity since Pearl Harbor, and the greatest condemnation of Xi Jinping and what a absolute joke he is the fact that he managed to get through the Trump presidency with China in much worse international standing after 4 years of Donald Trump than it was at the beginning. I mean, this guy
could you explain like the main point that's kind of China's problem now, that like the main, let's say, bad position they've maneuvered themselves into? What is the main symptom or the main aspect of that? Is it economically? Is it militarily? Is it what is the main aspect of that?
Well, they've been. I am absolutely not like a Peter Zeihan adherent or someone who believes that China's about to fall apart or something like that. You really need to not understand history or nationalism at all to believe that. But I do believe that China is in a very vulnerable position and has been convinced by Pentagon propaganda that they're a lot, which was also Putin's problem, being convinced by Pentagon propaganda that they're actually a lot stronger than they are. And for probably, perhaps for understandable domestic nationalist concerns, Xi Jinping's response to Donald Trump was an epical, historical failure. There was a point when, in 2017, where Xi Jinping went to Davos. This is very early on in the Trump presidency. He said, look, this guy is scary. He's nuts. Don't worry. China is here for you. We're going to be the guarantor of globalization. We're going to be the sane actors. We're gonna make sure the world gets through this okay. And honestly, I saw that and I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, like that like we are, this is a real problem for the United States. This is a real problem for US empire. But then again, this is for like nationalist reasons. China chose to react to Trump's serial insults by trying to play the same game. This whole concept of wolf warrior diplomacy. It's like, oh, now the world's multilateral because a bunch of Pentagon strategists told us the world is multilateral because Pentagon strategists exist to sell weapons. So we're going to believe it and we're going to double down on it and we're going to exert our power and we're going to we're going to, when the US does something, we're going to beat up on Canada. Just absolute idiocy and arrogance and alienating all the people by playing a poor man's Donald Trump game. And they have backed off from that a bit. The main sort of advocate of that, like, oh, we're the tough, mean, hard China, has been relegated off to being deputy wallet inspector somewhere. But they realize how badly they've screwed up with their sort of wolf warrior stuff, but the damage is done. And I think Xi Jinping, the beauty of the US system is that we can make a terrible mistake like Donald Trump and then rotate on to the next one. And I mean, Xi Jinping's still standing there. And
could I add something?
I tend to ramble.
I mentioned earlier that I've been studying power and theories of power. And maybe one way to look at this, maybe you'll find this interesting as well, is there's this notion by William Domhoff. I don't know if you're familiar with him, called the four network theory of power. And it's kind of a, let's say, a compromise between so-called elite theorists like Machiavellians that speak of, in a let's say monolithic elite representing power, and the pluralists who are just kind of focusing on different interest groups. So Domhoff kind of brought about this, let's say, compromise where he speaks of there is a particular elite, but it's kind of dispersed in multiple networks. He says it's four networks. I would say the base idea is correct, but you could probably, depending on what your intention is in your analysis, you could probably choose to look at different networks. But specifically, some of the networks are economic power, military power, political power, and ideological power. I think those are the four that he specifically mentions. And I think I would certainly agree with you when it comes to ideological or cultural power, however you want to call it. If you look at Chinese people, they wear blue jeans. They were, I mean, this is a gross simplification, but in a way, the culture, the American culture of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, California, New York, this kind of the American culture is unquestionably dominant in the world. There is no doubt about that. But then if you look at economic aspects, would you not agree that you just mentioned Deng Xiaoping, potentially there is, there's a reversal of that with Xi Jinping. I'm not too well versed on the economic aspect there. But in relative terms, would you not say that in economic terms that like since, let's say, post Second World War or towards the end of the Cold War, that like especially in respect to China, that the relative economic power has waned of America, especially when looking at, I know people often say that it's actually not really a problem, but especially if you look at, you know, attempts at, you know, de-dollarization, quote unquote, that's probably something you'll face palm about, but like, do you get what I'm getting at?
So de-dollarization is a joke.
Yeah,
It
I
is.
was expecting.
I mean, it is. I think it's probably a good idea. You know, I do believe that other countries should have sovereignty. I simply no longer believe they have any.
Okay.
But I think de-dollarization would be a great idea. I don't see anybody who's really trying it. I think the last real rival to the United States, in the context of the liberal, you know, rules-based international order that we played with for a while, really probably only pursued in the 1990s, and then quickly gave up on when we saw that Europe could actually compete with us on that.
Okay.
Europe was a very real rival to the United States at the turn of this century. The mass, you know, higher population, higher economy, and the truly frightening plausibility that you know, George W. Bush made a reality for a moment with his invasion of Iraq, of the European Union and all of its capacities and wealth allying with the resources of Russia. Which is why we made destroying Ukraine such a priority over the past 20 years.
I agree.
And very successfully so. And Europe presented a real rivalry to US dollar dominance in the euro. And that has been crushed, just crushed. And if you look at like currency reserves at this point, you can definitely tell a story of declining, you know, countries choosing to have like maybe 5% less dollars than they maintained in the year 2000.
Overall, it seems to be around like declined by around 20%. But would you just claim that that's like, let's say, common volatility of dollar as a reserve?
Well, the thing is,
is there any meaning to that recent decline?
Oh, I think there's meaning to everything. But I would also point out that a lot of that replacement, or the majority of it, so say like we had, I don't have the numbers in front of me, say that, you know, 60% of currency reserves were US in the year 2000. Now it's 55%, perhaps down to 40%. It's been replaced by 30% European, you know, euro as the reserves. And at this point, the European Union is simply a US vassal organization. So, and in fact, if you consider the fact that Europe has lost whatever autonomy it has for the next generation, in fact, sort of US euro currency reserves are now at like 70% of everything that's on offer.
What is the main mechanism of US control over Europe? What is the main factor there?
I'm going to sound very normie, Harvard Kennedy School here, and I apologize, but it is simply that Europe chose to focus. Well, they made two choices. They chose to focus on welfare over defense spending, but then they also chose to acquiesce in every dumb thing that the United States has done. I mean, Europe was dismembered fundamentally. I mean, a lot of poor decisions, but Europe was dismembered by the refugee crisis that the United States created in Syria and Libya and in Iraq before that. And Europe just sort of nodded and went along, in part because they believed they didn't have the choice to push back against idiotic US ideas, because they just chose to focus more on social spending than on their own defense capabilities. It's a choice that Europe made, and it's a choice that's paid off in a lot of ways. But it's fascinating just watching, you know, as far as like direct pathways, I can't speak to, but like just watching how this era of 20 years of Europe just sort of like, well, you know, we've got We've got a great welfare state and free college, which is amazing, and we're incredibly jealous of in the United States. So we'll just sort of nod along with the United States. But like 20 years ago, like Europe had a bunch of businesses that competed with U.S. businesses, and they don't anymore. The biggest companies in the world, well, really up until 2008, were all banks. Europe had a bunch of banks that competed with U.S. banks. U.S. banks have recovered, European banks have not, and the sort of commanding heights of the economy have moved off into tech companies or what have you. And it was really easy to minimize for a while, like, oh, tech companies don't really matter that much, blah, 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 blah. This is all just artifacts of weird US equity valuations, this, that, and the other thing. Well, we've got these great industrial champions, and now Tesla's coming in and ripping all of those, ripping the heart out of those industrial champions. So it's like these things all get together. I think the power of inertia, to go back to an earlier question of yours, please stop me if I'm rambling too much. I can just
I can add one thing to what you've just said. Like I'm not changing the topic. One thing, it's just a symbolic thing. It's not doesn't necessarily mean that much, but there's this accusation by Seymour Hersh about the pipelines being blown up. And I'm not trying to change the topic and ask you about the pipelines, but my point is, if it turns out that the US blew up the German pipelines, I can almost imagine nothing happening. You know what I mean? I can almost imagine nothing happening, which is, which would be unimaginable if it was a genuine foreign attack. You know what I mean? If it was a genuine foreign terrorist attack, then all hell would break loose, right? But the fact that nothing would happen kind of gives the vibe, let's say, of a client relationship. You know what I mean?
Well, that choice has already been made. It's much akin, actually, in the reverse. After 9/11, we decided that Saudi Arabia was too valuable a client, so we just stopped looking into it. Right. And Germany, I believe there has been a fairly serious German investigation of this, but I think they're going to stop talking about it because the relationship is just too valuable. I think Seymour Hersh specifically, is a national treasure. From the My Lai massacre, he's an extraordinary guy. I do think he's getting a little too old and a little too faithful in the competence of our imperial overlords. If you think about what Seymour Hersh, that story he put out there, is actually kind of a compliment to the United States. This idea that of course, and then at the Naval War College there's a special group. I'm not sure. I'd like it like there's a special, cool, right? It sounds amazing. It's this Tom Clancy fantasy. It's like, no, some Ukrainian oligarch was able to put together a team of folks to go blow this thing up. Like that I believe more than I believe Hersh's very elaborate tale of U.S. competence. I have zero faith. After the past 20 years, I have zero faith in the competence of sort of the U.S. intelligence community.
But you're kind of implying that the competence has declined, right? Like, would you assume that there was a time where U.S. could have pulled that off?
No. I don't see so I'm writing a book right now called American Empire, the First 100 Years. And it's really extraordinary what a bunch of Keystone Cops, that's a very old reference, what a bunch of lunatic idiots have been running the U.S. National security establishment forever. We have had some very capable people at the State Department. I actually think George H.W. Bush, or maybe it's just the absolute clown car of people that's followed him, but the first Bush, who was in charge from 89 to 93, does seem like he really did seem to know what was up and have some ideas. Nobody since. But the vast majority of the Cold Warriors were idiots. Okay. I maintain that the United States won the Cold War in 1956. The Soviet Union was over as a serious challenge to U.S. hegemony.
I was gonna push you on that, especially the 2 points coming to my head at the same time. One is, you mentioned earlier that there was a serious threat was Germany and
Mm-hmm.
Japan, and you
Mm-hmm.
actually just skipped over the Soviet Union. So first of
Mm-hmm.
all, I find that interesting, because I'd probably agree to some extent, is that the how do you say, the Soviet Union like a bit of a boogeyman that never
Mm-hmm.
actually represented the threat that was made out to be.
Yeah.
But then second of all, it's like, if they're so incompetent, how come it is the most successful empire? Would that mean that everyone else is even more incompetent, or what is actually then driving this exceptional success?
We have a continent.
Okay.
We have a continent. Like our national territory is a continent. If every little
But so is
piece
Russia's.
of, huh?
But so is Russia's.
But
Or the Soviet
Russia's is
Union. The Soviet
not
Union to that extent.
like, is it though? Like, if you look at Russia, like functional Russia, it's sort of like a rim on Europe. And then there's a lot of territory that they were able to hold on to because nobody wanted, and then they had nukes when people discovered things they actually wanted in that territory. The United States is a continent. The United States has inertia. The United States was able to benefit from 30 years of European suicide in the world wars. We were just put into such a advantageous position, remain in such an advantageous position. And there are brilliant people in the United States, in the government very, very occasionally, but in terms of economics, in terms of business, in terms of society, in terms of, like, it is an incredibly vibrant, I love my country, an incredibly vibrant place, but more importantly, also like of massive population and wealth, that weird combo of being able to be spoken of in terms of population terms, of not at the same scale, but like in kind of the same class as like India or China or Indonesia, yet also having wealth levels comparable to, say, the Netherlands. I mean, that is an incredible historic anomaly that is fed upon and just sort of increases by the fact that we have a continent, that we were put in this space of world leadership almost inadvertently in 1917. I did just want to finish that thought. So the Cold War was over in 1956. It was the absolute bloody-minded idiocy of most of the Washington, D.C. establishment that kept the Soviet Union limping along until 1989, until 1992. I mean, Vietnam is just this incredible own goal, utterly pointless, utterly savage, utterly destructive. And it's funny, something I realized recently.
Just before you move on, what happened in 1956 that marked the potential end of it, and how they, like, did they actually keep the Soviet Union alive, like literally? Did they actually like finance the Soviet Union to some extent to keep going?
People make that argument. I haven't delved into that argument, and I think it's probably a little too right-wing loony bin that the United States was actually bankrolling the Soviet Union at a certain point. I don't know. I haven't parsed those claims, but the Soviet Union as an serious, terrifying international entity was absolutely a creation of the United States. The Soviet Union won World War II, 100%. I'm not one of those people who would ever try to minimize the incredible sacrifices that 20 million Russians died or something, just unimaginable numbers. They were the victors of World War II, but they were bankrolled by the United States. Like the terrifying Red Army, the capacity, the power that allowed the Soviet Union to be a serious competitor to the United States in the post-World War II era up until 1956 or so, was a creation of U.S. policy to crush Germany and Japan. Again, not minimizing at all the incredible sacrifices. They did the fighting. They are the people who destroyed the Nazis, but they did it with U.S. sponsorship. And that created a situation where the U.S. kind of felt like it had no choice but to acquiesce in this vast Russian empire across Eastern and Central Europe. We had no choice but to acquiesce in their relationship with Chinese actors that ended up taking over the country, which was very terrifying for us. Korea was a real thing. Like, I'm very anti-US wars, but it does seem in books I've read on the conflict that, like, Stalin was like, all right, let's shoot our shot. Let's see if we can actually spread communism by gun. And I think there probably was real value in the United States stopping that. After that was stopped, so the Soviet Union's power was rooted in the incredible material support, and just the fact that they were, Europe was destroyed and they were the people on the ground who could take it over. Mm-hmm. They were also aided by incredible ideological weight, incredible impressiveness to the entire global South. That was very much not. There's this idiotic YouTube channel that talked about and European empires all ended in 1945 because they decided it was a bad thing to do, which is a tremendous misrepresentation of what actually happened. European empires ended in, like, I don't know, 1980 or 1992, depending on whether you go with Rhodesia or South Africa. And was still a very open question well into the 70s. Whether European elements were going to hold on to empire in Africa, that sort of thing. So in that context of decolonization, the Soviets looked like a much more credible ally against these European empires and the United States that had stepped into 2 world wars to save those European empires. In 1956, the Soviets completely blew up their credibility as an anti-imperial actor. By rolling the tanks into Hungary at the exact same time as Dwight Eisenhower, God bless him, a guy who committed many crimes, but also did a few incredibly intelligent things. Basically told so in 1956, Israel, France, and Britain didn't like Nasser, the leader of Egypt at that time, cooked up an invasion. And did what they'd always done.
Is that the Suez Crisis?
Yes, that's the Suez Crisis. Went in and took it, and Eisenhower, in one of those rare, brilliant moments that are usually the most victorious moments in U.S. history, U.S. empire history, whatever, are the points at which somebody like Roosevelt or Eisenhower goes like, "Hey, that'd be dumb. Let's not do that." Yeah. And that's the point when Eisenhower said to France and Britain, and Israel, "Fuck no. We're not doing this."
I remember reading about this,
When he did that, contrasted with the Soviet Union rolling tanks into Hungary, Egypt, of course, ended up having a falling out with the United States, and we fell back into sort of a variety of pathologies and whatnot. But simply saying, no, actually, the era of empires is done. So in 1956, the Soviets entirely undermine their anti-imperial case. The United States, in one of our brief flashes of brilliance, underlines our own anti-imperial case. And then a lot of the momentum that the Soviets had from World War II begins to dissipate. The fact that their economic system was always impracticable, begins to wear. It was not a serious threat to the United States. You can probably...
you would argue BRICS is not going to be.
No. To finish a thought, we're talking about Europe. The euro was a serious rival to the United States. That has dissipated. The idea that the BRICS are going to put together some kind of currency that, like, they've added Argentina. That's sure to bring, fiscal stability. The fact that Europe couldn't do it, a geographically contiguous territory of mostly developed countries that have very similar ideas as to how international currencies and financial markets should work. The fact that they couldn't do it, and the idea that BRICS is going to do it. I briefly had some credibility in the post-Ukraine oil spike, but like, they've got all these commodities, and that's important. Russia and South Africa. So perhaps some kind of commodities-based currency, but the swiftness with which the commodity crunch is dissipated makes all that look pretty illusory.
Well, in one way, I could like salvage my argument with the plateauing empire is that like we'd kind of our views on this would probably converge because the globe is kind of an upper limit, right? So if you're consolidating power on the globe, you kind of are forced to plateau because like you can't except we're gonna have like space conquest soon. But
there's no zero-sum game though. There's no like the potentials within our globe, and yes, beyond it, are infinite for human development, for economic development. There's no zero-sum game here, and I think that folks who imagine that there is some kind of geopolitical game, some kind of like fight of rivals, this sort of thing, are kind of missing reality. Like it just doesn't exist. That's the fundamental nature of empire that the British Empire and the US Empire share, is that we had the globe. We have the globe. We've had the globe since 1917. The British had the globe after 1815. And what you do with that can be miraculous, can be extraordinary. I think that there really was a moment. I'm writing this book, American Empire, the First 100 Years, and my chapter on the 2000s, I'm doing a chapter on each decade, is Murdering Utopia, the George W. Bush years. Like I really do believe in the 1990s, there was a possibility for a US-led, rules-based international order that just did extraordinary things for human flourishing. We saw some of those possibilities in China's rise. And I think, unfortunately, that moment is over. And people are thinking in more reductive terms of like, oh, it's about territory and geographical limits. It's so not, and it so didn't need to be. And it's like that kind of thinking that I don't do enough to talk against on my channel, but I'd like to do more.
But like, would you see a form of internal fragmentation then? Like, how would you characterize something like? Because I'm trying to get at your let's say definition of true sovereignty in a sense, because like how would you characterize the difference between that we make, or not we actually, I'd say more the Americans make, between Israel and Iran, for example, right? There's obviously a different kind of relationship, right? And there's obviously a certain problem with Iran, right?
Yeah.
So if I like concede with the idea that like it's still total American global consolidation, would that represent maybe a form of internal fragmentation, that there is like a sort of fragmentation into a block of which, let's say, the old school white majority of American peoples are allied with, which is Israel, right? And then another fragment of which the whatever third worldist Islamic world is more allied with. Does that make sense? Like, where is there a like? Is that difference between Israel and Iran? That's just an example now. That could apply to any other. Is that difference like completely like trivial or illusory, or where is the meaningful difference there?
It's not trivial. It's not illusory. The United States is not omnipotent. That's the mistake we made in Vietnam. That's the mistake we made in Iraq and Afghanistan. This idea that we can just impose exactly what we want as violently as possible, and there's not going to be any problems. We can't do that. Thank God we can't do that. But I think you're getting at an idea I've been thinking about a lot recently, is that really all world politics at this point are just internal US empire politics.
Okay, yeah, so like fragmentation, like, in a sense.
Yeah, it's just different ways of I mean, and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are tremendously successful, vastly more successful than they deserve to be, because they have, I think, a clearer understanding of what is actually going on than most. And they put tremendous effort and time and money into Washington, D.C. cocktail parties. That's unfortunately a lot more powerful and important than how many tanks you have in this day and age. And they know that. They're in a state of incredible vulnerability because there's a lot of Washington, D.C. that desperately wants a war with Iran. And that war with Iran in day 5 will completely extirpate the Saudi oil and gas industry. So it's a risky game that they're playing, but they're playing it in an intelligent way. Iran is consciously maintained by the US state and the Israeli state as an enemy. This is effort, a lot of hard work has been put in to keeping Iran out of the mainstream of nations. One of my favorite data points is that in the 1990s, Iran was inviting US oil companies in. 12 to 15 years after the revolution, when all of these rabid fanatics were still relatively young men, they desperately wanted U.S. oil companies to come in. They desperately wanted normalization. That's the whole Khatami presidency. And Clinton was like, nah, sorry, we need some enemies. In the Israeli leadership, in part to, I mean, the Israeli leadership more honorably wanted to use the Iranian threat as a way to sell normalization with the Palestinians to the Israeli people. This is exclusively in the 1990s. This is pre the Netanyahu era. The United States wanted to hold on to Iran and Iraq dual containment in the 1990s to desperately find a reason to hold on to as much of its military industrial complex as possible. It's very profitable for Washington, D.C. military industrial complex in the face of U.S. taxpayer opposition, successfully. They managed to, whining about Saddam Hussein in Iran and a variety of other stratagems did get us to 9/11. And the fact that we'll never, certainly in my lifetime, won't see any less money spent on weapons in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. And also because we're already
that's a little negative. I do think there is a scope for cutting the U.S. defense budget, but it certainly doesn't happen, and it's certainly not happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, it is